Okay, we're recording, so just to make sure that Steve didn't have that joke in there. I'm just kidding. Joining us, this is a premiere episode. We're talking about the collapse of global oil prices, the international implications of that, how it relates to the domestic oil and energy market, and specifically the conflict between Russia and Saudi that sort of drove this iteration of it. And to do that, an old friend of mine is joining us, Steve Cook. He's a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations.
What's up?
Steve, it's great to have you on. How are you?
I'm hanging tough.
Yep.
I'm hanging tough. Yep. How about you?
I'm doing all right. I mean, it's,
good.
It is what it is. But, I personally certainly don't have much to complain about, but, obviously it's a terrible situation. I will say, and you're wearing a skiing t-shirt. I went to one of your book launches. I was the only person there not in a suit. So favor returned.
I'm sorry to put a suit on, but I do remember we once went back and forth about short sleeve button down shirts and a tie, the appropriateness of that, which is a never. But I figured under these circumstances, a t-shirt was okay.
No, I think a t-shirt is fine. I'm very partial. I've been doing long sleeve shirt and a tie. I like that look actually.
Yeah.
That I like, but short sleeve tees in general, I'm not really a fan of. It doesn't seem appropriate to me.
No.
Can you talk in the beginning about how Trump has been? Because let's be honest here. I think one of the most disturbing possibilities that could come out of this is we already see these bailouts, which are essentially just giant wealth transfers and monopoly consolidators. The enormous concern of all of this is the upshot is the next round of small business bailouts is for Exxon and Chevron.
Right.
So can you talk specifically about how the Trump administration, and look, certainly this happened, especially with natural gas under Obama.
Right.
But that when they talk about energy independence, they're not talking about finally, transitioning to a innovative and, sustainable model. We're talking about aggressively exploiting domestic energy markets. That has environmental implications. It also affects the global price.
Right. And we are seeing kind of the fulcrum of this during the Trump administration, but you have to go back to at least 2005 and when President George W. Bush announced the goal of the United States was to become energy independent in the next 20 years or so. And then if you remember back to the 2008 presidential campaign, Sarah Palin, the Republican vice presidential candidate, drill, baby, drill. Obviously, she and Senator McCain didn't win, but President Obama did, in fact, oversee the greatest expansion of exploitation of American fossil fuels in the history of the country. I think it's the history of the country. And the Trump administration has continued that. I mean, Sarah Palin said, drill, baby, drill. And we fracked. The Obama administration coincided with the revolution in hydraulic fracturing, otherwise known as fracking, which has been a boon to the natural gas industry. And we have also become the biggest producer of oil. And we have just reached the point of energy independence in terms of fossil fuels, specifically oil. This has nothing really to do with any investment in alternative energies, in wind, in solar, plug-in electric vehicles, and so on and so forth. It is all about the exploitation of hydrocarbons.
Yeah, and not even kind of finding efficiencies. So it's been really, really aggressive. Now, how does that affect? I mean, it's intuitively obvious, but just in terms of supply, but just how has these aggressive moves in the last 20 years affected the OPEC countries specifically, countries that are sort of known to rely, we look at Iran and it goes like, what's the main export? Oil. Okay. Right. And then the second one, I think, is like pistachios, places where it's like, okay, this is a very important. Yes.
Here's a good way of thinking about it.
Yes.
As dependent as Iran is on oil exports, it's the least dependent economy in the Persian Gulf on oil. So Iraq, 95% of its budget is derived from oil exports. Kuwait and Saudi Arabia is 80+%, but there really doesn't have much of an economy beyond that because everything else is based on hydrocarbons. Oman, Bahrain, further afield, Algeria. These are countries that are really one crop economies. So as the United States has produced and it's had this impact on prices, this era, we've entered into an era really of generally low oil prices. Now, it's really low. I think Brent was at $14.40 today.
Yeah.
This is very, very far away from where these countries can balance their budget. So it puts tremendous strain on them stability-wise. The other thing that the United States production has done, it has removed a certain amount of leverage from Saudi Arabia as the swing producer. Saudi Arabia doesn't take a lot to get the oil out of the ground. You tap a well and it comes up. You don't have to inject a lot of chemicals or water to pressurize the wells. You have to do some, but it's a relatively low-cost producer. But the United States flooding the markets with its hydrocarbons has taken that leverage away from the Saudis. 2014, when we had a big drop in oil prices, that was in part a Saudi effort to do damage to the American shale industry. They couldn't do it, which led to the agreement in 2016 between Saudi Arabia and Russia to cut productions, to kind of put a floor under the price of a barrel of oil. That succeeded until 3.5 weeks ago.
Right. So what's the dynamic behind that? Russia has gained a lot of credibility in the Middle East, which you document. And again,
right.
This is very much in one of our conversations that, I mean, people know, I think, different political positions across the board. But this is one we really want to focus on how things are actually working and why. So you just say, basically like, look, in the mindset of a fair amount of Middle Eastern leadership, and it can be as that basically Obama portrayed Mubarak.
Yep.
Putin had Assad's back. That's a huge credibility builder.
Right.
Explain that, and then how Russia maybe, though, overinterpreted the appreciation.
Yeah. So in short, I mean, we don't have hours here, but look, Arab leaders who were obviously not enthusiastic about the Arab uprisings in 2011 and 2012, saw the Obama administration basically after a week or so of protests in Egypt say to President Mubarak, it's time to look for a graceful way out, as a profound betrayal. Here was Hosni Mubarak. He had carried America's water in the Middle East for almost 30 years. A lot of the stuff that he did was deeply unpopular with a large number of Egyptians. He did it anyway. And within a week of protests of tens of thousands of people in Tahrir Square and other parts of the country, the Obama administration was ready to kind of ease him out of power. Now, that's not really the way the Arab world looks at it. Arab leaders look at it. They look at it as it was a total betrayal. I was there for part of this. It had nothing to do with what Obama said. The Egyptian people and the Egyptian military, most importantly, brought down Hosni Mubarak. But nevertheless, Politics is perception. So the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Israelis, everybody else sees this as the president of the United States betrayed his ally of 30 years. Bashar al-Assad is in trouble. And instead of betraying his ally, Vladimir Putin deploys force to Syria to save the Assad regime. This, whether Arab leaders loved Bashar al-Assad or not, and most of them do not, this demonstrated something about Russia's commitment to their allies in the region that really boosted Russia's stock in the region. And a series of events, the negotiation of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, otherwise known as the Iran nuclear deal.
Right.
Then the Trump administration, the kind of general incompetence of the Trump administration, the deep and profound polarization here in the United States has, accumulated to the point where people in the Middle East, leaders in the Middle East, look at the United States as spent, tired, ideological, and incompetent. In contrast, they were coming to see Russia as competent, ready to lead, non-ideological, and someone who was willing to stand by his allies. And that was the difference. And so there has been this moment, the Egyptians exploring a relationship with Moscow, the Saudis and the Emiratis saying, hey, look, we've got to have the Russians at the table. That old baggage of the Soviet Union, that ideological baggage of the Soviet Union, no longer there, signing billions of dollars of deals with the Russians. And so in Washington, everybody was kind of gripped with the idea that, okay, the United States is withdrawing from the region. The Russians and the Chinese are going to be the ones that are going to order the region. And then we get to what happened in the last, as I said, 3.5 weeks, where the deal between Russia and Saudi Arabia over oil was fraying, and the Russians didn't want to maintain the deal as it was. And the Saudis came to a meeting of what's called OPEC Plus, which is the OPEC members plus 10 other countries, including Russia, but Russia is really the big dog in the plus, and said, hey, look, this is how much we should cut. And the Russians said, no. We should cut, but you should cut X amount more than everybody else because you're Saudi Arabia, and we'll cut this much, and this one only cuts that. And this raised alarm bells in Riyadh that what the Russians were really trying to do was steal market share and revenue from the Saudis, because the Saudis felt like if they agreed to what the Russians wanted, the Russians would cheat anyway, grabbing market share and obviously taking revenue away from the Saudis. So what did Mohammed bin Salman do? He said, I'm not going to be played for a sucker by Vladimir Putin. I don't care about this new relationship. I'm going to now say, I'm going to produce as much as I want, and I'm going to offer Saudi oil on a discount. And we had this runaway plunge in the price of oil. And then it became kind of like a thing between Putin and MBS. Over
I thought you were going to say he was going to invite Putin to get a marriage license someday. Sorry. So what, I think, sorry. I mean, look, it's true. It's Jesus Christ. So what then was the Russian justification though for having this differing approach, and how did they both, I mean, because again, in this article, and we're very used to, and correctly, 100% of my estimation, to see Saudi Arabia itself as deeply systemically problematic on any number of areas, and also MBS himself as essentially a personal murderer by all available evidence. Mm-hmm. In this context, though, the Saudi position just seems a lot more, it doesn't seem as complicated, and it seems more straightforward. Well, prices are going down, right? Corona's coming, there's going to be lesser demand. What is Russia even saying as sort of its presentational game phase for why you would even want to not obviously cut production?
Right.
In that context?
And look, it takes Vladimir Putin to make MBS look reasonable in this situation. And so it's actually not Putin. It's one of his advisors. But what they were
because I'm actually surprised. I mean, Putin does actually, again, strike me as a guy who, regardless of anything else, would certainly be able to grok the basics of, a sort of situation like this. I mean, I think Trump could, get that,
Right. And the cooperation with Saudi Arabia is a big win for the Russians, who have been pulling at America's traditional allies in the region.
Right.
What I think the Russian oil and gas people wanted to do is what they said was, let's see how coronavirus affects the global economy. Remember, this is late February, early March, and let's wait and see. Now,
they're Sean Hanniting it a little bit.
A little bit, right?
Okay. Maybe it's just the flu. Maybe it's just the cold. Right.
Okay. And whether they were Sean Hanniting it for real or they had ulterior motives is unclear. But what the Saudis suspect, and I think is probably not a bad suspicion, is that the Russians felt this is an opportunity to do some damage to American shale producers, because it really was the American, as we were discussing before, the American ability to produce all of this oil and all of this national gas that has created this permanently low price of oil situation in which the Russians and the Saudis and everybody else have problems. So the suspicion is that they wanted to do damage to American producers.
Right.
The Saudis, from their telling the story is, look, we were not going to surrender to the Russians, and you Americans were collateral damage. The problem is the collateral damage raises the ire of people like Senator James Inhofe, who happens to be the chairman in the Senate Armed Services Committee and represents Oklahoma,
Right.
an oil state, and the entire Texas delegation, senators and members of an oil state, right? These are the guys who, when MBS orders the hit on Jamal Khashoggi, help the Trump administration shield the Saudis from punishment. They were pissed because the Saudis went too far. They said, we're going to pump like crazy. We're going to pump 300 more thousand barrels a day, and we're going to offer it at $8 a barrel to the Chinese. This was going to have a profound impact on the economies of Oklahoma, Texas, and Alaska. So he went too far. And the United States, this collateral damage had a profound impact. And you had these stories of these meetings with these senators sending letters and then meeting with the Saudi ambassador in Washington and basically reading her the riot act.
So then what is actually, can we touch on that for a minute, the Chinese role? Is there a potential? I mean, you kind of indicated that one of the only possible angles for a sort of regeneration of the global energy market anytime soon is that, China seems to have successfully contained the virus. They've had the biggest economic contraction there since 1992. They had an over 6% contraction in the last quarter. Right. So they're going to go on their own stimulus plan. Is the idea for the Saudis and for other, potential OPEC partners to just say like, okay, here we go. Like the Chinese will want it. They need to stimulate. Let's get that. Let's move product there.
That's where the game has been anyway. Everybody has looked to China and Asia as, even with the way in which the Trump administration has dealt with our energy policy, you see how, although we haven't done anything to decarbonize the economy, there are savings, there are efforts to decarbonize, and oil producers, the energy producers, particularly Asia, is the real growth. China is the big winner here because all of a sudden they're doing this, they're real economy, and they're doing it with very, very cheap oil. The problem is, I think people are overestimating how quickly China is going to be able to open up. I rarely watch television, but when I come in from a run or I'm done on the stationary bike, I put on CNN for 15 minutes in my basement while I'm stretching out after one of these things. And this morning, I just happened to catch a report from Wuhan. And, people say, oh, Wuhan's back open.
Not exactly.
Wuhan, look, you're in New York City. You're in a much harder hit place than I am. But Wuhan looks like the way Washington is. Places are open. People aren't able to go in. People, it's more curbside kind of things and stuff like that. It's not open. I mean, I think but still, the Chinese are the big winners here. I think the Chinese, though, are a bit smarter than the United States or the Russians. It's purely extractive. If they can get Saudi oil, Iranian oil on the cheap, that's great for them. They're not with MBS and, Javad Zarif and, all these terror Middle East in the way that the United States has over the course of 25, 30 years in particular.
So they want to get, so regardless of, they don't want to get sort of as enmeshed in any of it. And I think, again, that's actually what a lot of people have said has been one of the great advantages generally of Chinese diplomacy, which has just been much more workmanlike, much more like, hey, let's just make an arrangement. We don't need all this ancillary empire drama, frankly, that, the United States.
There's a nasty side of it, the Chinese care not a lick about the human rights of Syrians, Iranians, Saudis, or anybody else. As long as they're getting their oil out of the region, they're perfectly willing to countenance the quality of regimes in the region. The problem is that we have become so enmeshed and so entangled in this stuff that we are doing crazy things.
And also, isn't it true? I mean, I guess just on that tip, and I want to, I think there's something to balance here where, I mean, on one hand, and the very, the clear response of the Chinese position and any number of critics of U.S. foreign policy and so on, which is like, okay, sure, there's all this human rights discourses, but Yemen, but the occupation, but and I think all of that is it's discourse. It's 100% true. On the other hand, I would say the pushback I'd give to some of my brethren on the left is that even if it's sort of like international law. Nobody follows international law, certainly not the United States and other, people with power. But international law allows a prime minister in the Caribbean to, even though they know that the United States isn't going to respect it, to say, hey, when you steal our ventilators, you're violating international law.
Right.
If you have a world that is governed by the logic of none of that stuff is even rhetorically in play, you don't have a ground to respond to it.
That's exactly what I was going to say. At least at a rhetorical level,
right?
There's something there. But but I think that in the end, however, the power politics in the Gulf is what is going to establish the rules of the road. And so I think that the Saudis may have overplayed their hands, States, but the Russians certainly overplayed their hands with the Saudis. And that doesn't mean that $20 billion worth of deals that were signed aren't going to happen. But I think the shine off of the relationship, the big hedge, King Salman went to Moscow. He was the first Saudi king to go to Moscow. Right. Putin came to Riyadh last fall and with great fanfare. I think the idea that this is going to be the flowering of Russian, Saudi, and Russian Emirati relations was a bit overstated. And I think, basically what you're seeing in the Gulf is no real power is going to order it in the way that the United States did from March 1991 until March 2003. It's kind of going to become this kind of free-for-all, and oil and energy security is going to be a driving factor there.
So what do you think? I mean, in the last couple of minutes then, I mean, I think that's pretty clear. The shine is kind of off of that. And also, that especially given the broader dynamics of Russian and Saudi history, there was some positive signals, but as soon as the trust is sort of broken again, right, one would imagine it would kind of revert to type. But now, I mean, the Saudis have pissed off the United States. There's an oil tanker, sitting right now. There's, off the coast of the States. There's, storage capacity at max there. And, Ted Cruz is taking to Twitter and all the rest of it. And as you point out, all of the same people that were very happy to, shield MBS from everything before, now they're pissed because it's it's another thing in addition to the just kind of broad economic shutdown that is hurting energy producing. So look, I want to always include in this conversation that ultimately we quite literally need to change our energy economy if we'd like to if we'd like to even have a species that can watch all of these ridiculous people do mishigas with each other all day. At some point, we're going to need to figure out how to sustainably breathe. But so I'd like you to talk to that longer term, but in the shorter term, take it in two. The shorter term, and this is also, by the way, another a minor one, but it is an embarrassment for Trump. He said a couple of weeks ago, I was at OPEC and I figured it out. And, it's going to be great. And then that was like within hours practically of the price, becoming less than a cup of coffee. So what are the immediate security and diplomatic implications? And then when does this ever start to tangibly transition, including even in the Middle East? I mean, is there anybody, in the region thinking of, what the next play is in a less carbon heavy society?
Well, I think let's take it from your last question. I actually think that people in the Middle East have been much more realistic about a decarbonized global economy than we have been here in the United States. I mean, what is Vision 2030 about? What is the Omani Vision 2040 about? What is the Emirati Vision 2020, Vision 2025? It's about decarbonizing, about a decarbonizing world. Look, I think the Emiratis have been way ahead of it. Look at Dubai. It's really more a transportation logistics hub, in addition to being the Emirates being an energy producer. So those countries recognize what the reality is, although they also understand how important it remains to Chinese growth and development in Asia and even Europe and the United States, because we haven't really taken the steps. What I think the view is here in the United States is, sure, a lot of the things that we're seeing, wind coming online, solar, plug-in electric hybrids, it's a small drop in the bucket of a barrel, in a barrel of oil. And until we really do things like tax carbon consumption, we're not going to have a shift. So what does it mean in terms of security? Well, now you have people who, as you said, you have people who are pissed off about Saudi Arabia who weren't previously pissed off about Saudi Arabia. I think there's going to be a kerfuffle in the Congress. I think with the coronavirus pandemic just hammering the United States, I don't think that the Congress really has a capacity to think about these things. I think, though, from what I know on the Hill, I think they'd been working on these things. I think they've been looking at Saudi Arabia. I think the issue is ripe for relitigation. What is our relationship with Saudi Arabia? What is worrying to me is how freighted with politics this is, so that we can't actually have a debate, whether it's the left end of the spectrum, the Saudis are evil, they're beyond the pale, and the right, we need to support the Saudis, we need to support the Saudis, we need to support the Saudis, and that you can't actually have a conversation about reconfiguring a relationship where people want to get out of the Middle East. It doesn't seem, because for rhetorical reasons, people think we're energy independent and drill, baby, drill, that we don't need to be there. And so the perception is that we're heading for the exits. And that's when the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Israelis and the Egyptians do all kinds of crazy things. So it's going to be very, very hard for us to extricate ourselves from the region, even if that's the appropriate thing to do. And I don't think that we're equipped at this point to have a healthy debate about it.
Right.
Which adds a further complication to this. So for the moment, immediate change, no. A kind of muddled, ugly status quo is what I think is going to be in the Gulf and the Middle East more generally going forward.
Do you think, just a final question? I mean, I take the point. I mean, look, and I also think people take, there's different roles. And if you're in the journalistic advocacy role or whatever, there's plenty of, there's an embarrassment of riches with Saudi Arabia, but plenty of other places as well. And obviously, I mean, you and I have talked even specifically about the US-backed efforts in Yemen, which are, quite grotesque. But right. I totally take your point that on a policy level, you simply need to be able to have, just like conversely, you need to be able to have people that can deal with North Korea or wherever. Like, it's just how the world works. I mean, you can't, not everything can be moralism at all. That being said, and actually maybe not necessarily that being said at all, this isn't in contradiction, but just reflecting on how easy it was for MBS to take in, like, his trip to the United States and Bloomberg and Bezos and Zuckerberg and The Rock. And, I think the big picture story.
Don't forget Morgan Freeman.
Morgan Freeman. Oh, come on, please. I'd like to forget that one. Some of us still have some childhood in us, man. But the,
every time I see Shawshank Redemption, which is like some piece of it every night, I can't get my head around the fact that he hung out with MBS. Anyway, go ahead.
It's like Andy wanted to see if we could do a deal to bring WWE wrestling to Oman. So I think that's, by the way, what it was mostly about. Obviously, I mean, look, this is capitalism. This is liquidity. And again, none of these people care about these human rights issues.
Well, yeah, look, MBS. Yeah. When he came here, it was like Vision 2030. The assumption was, oil prices would be at a level where they could spend gazillions of dollars. They were gonna basically buy like a server farm and plant it in the middle of the Saudi desert. I can't think of a worse place to do it, right?
Right.
I mean, those server farms take up a lot of energy. It's hot. They need to be cool. I mean, it was, they were coming with riches in hand. And to be honest with you, look, MBS came to the United States saying, basically, I'm out to change Saudi Arabia's relationship with extremist Islam. I'm ready to do a deal with the Israelis, and women can drive. I mean, he was pushing every single hot button there is for members of Congress and Americans on Saudi Arabia in the post 9/11 era.
Right.
And it worked.
And it worked. And people need to watch that human rights discourse because, again, I would, and I know this, obviously, I think this is another thing I'm sure we've talked about, but just the idea that even the reforms, which of course are good reforms in Saudi. And I'm sure I have no doubt actually for anything else you say about MBS, you could say a lot, that he would like Saudi Arabia to look more like the Emirates. And that would mean obviously a much more relaxed atmosphere and a much easier place to live. That's just objective reality.
Right.
But, the distinction from, okay, women can drive, but the woman that led these protests are going to get rounded up and thrown in jail because it is not a result of their activism. It's a result of my beneficence.
Right. That's exactly right. That's
yeah.
right. So I never call it, it's, you can't really call it reform. You have to call it change.
Yeah.
So women can drive, which has had a profound effect on the lives of women, the economy, and so on and so forth. But it's top down. It's, I have given you this. Don't ask for anything else. And if you do, you're in jeopardy.
Right.
Yeah.
And is that, last question, but this really does interest me. Look, this is another, these are huge ones here, but it's not that, we're not Kamalis revering Ataturk, but the difference was, and Ataturk was autocratic, and Ataturk, all the usual stipulations. But the Shah, father and son, were just nasty U.S.-backed dictators, and they implemented, no, we're not. You should be out wearing bikinis. I read that in Vogue. Go do it. Whereas Ataturk, actually, yes, it was controlling. Yes, it was authoritarian. All of the criticisms stipulate, but he also actually did something that was real in the culture, and it was a reciprocal process to some extent.
I think,
would you say that's true?
I would say yes, but no. I would say just it's true, but it's not. It can be a little overdrawn because certainly there were Turks who were more receptive to that because of Turkey's relationship with the West well before the Turkish nationalist revolution. But still, you see, for all of everything and the kind of thoroughgoing changes that Ataturk wrought in the early part of the 20th century, when the Justice and Development Party came to power, their essential, their message was essentially that the Republic was an unnatural detour from the kind of more, let's say, organic development from the empire to something else.
Right. Right.
But you're absolutely right. In Iran, it's sort of like took these things and kind of grafted it in an unnatural way on a society, and a very thin layer of elite embraced this stuff, but no one else really did. Right. And that was the potency of the revolution.
And maybe in Turkey, the reason it's so much. Maybe it's even 70-30. In 30 grafted and 7, but in Iran it's 99-1.
Right. And the difference actually is in Turkey, for all of its authoritarianism, and particularly now, there are institutions, seemingly democratic institutions, that have more content and meaning than they did either in Iran or many other places in the region. So that gave people an opportunity to voice their grievances and process them in certain ways. But MBS has no intention of anything other than the gift from MBS down. You may drive. You may go to a concert. You may go to a movie. And this is all I think we've talked about this before. This was a very shrewd maneuver on his part to build societal support, to have a reservoir of support so that when he runs into trouble with his family and non-royal elites, they'll have to contend with a society that is enjoying the benefits of what Mohammed bin Salman has given them. 20 and 30 somethings They all don't want to be intellect. They want to go to concerts. They want to go to, WWE and stuff like that. Not everybody's a journalist. Not everybody's a poet. Not everybody's an intellectual. They want to live the good life because the Saudis are connected to the world. They know what's going on.
Right. Absolutely. Well, Stephen A. Cook, as always, it's just a great pleasure having you.
I don't know how we got to bikinis from oil, but hey, it's cool.
Well, this is how we're it's all connected, man. Stephen A. Cook, Senior Fellow Counsel on Foreign Relations. You and your family stay safe.
You do the same, Michael. Great to talk to you.
Thanks.
Awesome.